You've probably heard that taking God's name in vain is a sin. And if you grew up in Christian circles, that meant saying, "Oh my goodness," instead of "Oh my God," and not using God's name as a curse word when you stubbed your toe. The problem is we've oversimplified the third commandment and we've missed the real meaning of this verse. So what I want to do in this video is I want to break this verse down a little bit further and look at what does it really mean to take the Lord's name in vain. And then we'll look at 3 examples of what that looks like in our life. But before we get there, hit that subscribe button so that you can stay up to date on videos that are coming out on this channel. So let's jump in and look at what the Bible really says about taking God's name in vain. This verse is found in Exodus chapter 20, verse 7, and it's part of the 10 commandments that Moses gives to the nation of Israel. And the verse says this: "You shall not take the Lord your God's name in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." Now, you've probably heard that verse before, or at least some semblance of that verse. And when we approach something that's familiar to us, we tend to read quickly and miss the real point. So what we have to do is we have to slow down and look a little bit deeper at what this verse is saying. The first question we should be asking is, what does it mean to take the name of the Lord? Another way you could translate this verse from the original language is you could say, "You shall not take up the name of the Lord in vain," or "You shall not bear the name of the Lord in vain." Another way of thinking about it is, for all of God's people, we are his representatives. What we do and what we say tells those around us something about God. Think about it this way. If you were to go into a store later today and the employee there treated you very rudely, you would probably be less likely to shop at that store in the future because that employee is a representative of that store. And of course, if the reverse is true, if the employee treated you exceptionally well, you are more likely to shop there in the future. And the same principle is true for all who follow God. We are image bearers of God. That's what Paul is telling us in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20, that we are his representatives, we are his ambassadors. How you talk, how you treat others, the words you say tells those around you something about God. And the challenge of this verse is to represent him well. The second question that we should ask of this verse when we slow down and read it again is, what does in vain mean? The Hebrew word that we translate as vain carries this meaning of being hollow, of empty, of worthless, of serving no good purpose. What this verse is saying is not that we should avoid using God's name as some do, rather we should be careful how we use it. We tend to downplay the value of names in our culture, but that wasn't so in ancient times. You see, names used to mean something. They carried weight. They told others something about you. What this commandment is getting at is that we are forbidden from using God's name, representing him, in a way that is wicked or worthless or for our own gain. Let me say it this way: you are God's ambassador. Therefore, you should represent him well to those around you. Most people think that this verse just means don't use God's name as a curse word and avoid saying, "Oh my God." But that's an oversimplification of this verse, and it misses the real meaning and the real significance of what God is trying to tell us. Now, I'm not advocating that we start using God's name as a curse word. I think his name is holy and full of power, and we should treat it with reverence and respect. However, I think we've oversimplified it, and I think this verse goes far beyond just not using God's name as a curse word. So let's look at 3 examples of how we take God's name in vain. The first way that we take God's name in vain is using God's name for our own gain. We take God's name in vain when we use his name to take advantage of others. Think about the TV preacher that says if you just give him money, then God will bless them. They're taking advantage of others in God's name for their own gain. But it's not just limited to TV preachers. Anybody who uses God's name to take advantage of somebody in big or small ways, they have taken God's name in vain, and God doesn't take kindly to that. Think about it if the roles were reversed and somebody was defrauding and taking advantage of other people in your name. You probably wouldn't take too kindly to what that person is doing. And that's why the Bible says, do not take the Lord's name in vain, because we are God's representatives. Therefore, we should not use God's name to get more money, to get more power, or to gain control over somebody else. Now, it's easy to point fingers at other people doing this, but we should really examine our own lives. I've seen so many people take advantage of their families and their friends and their coworkers and their neighbors, all in God's name, and that is what it means to take God's name in vain. And we should all be careful to represent God well in what we do and what we say and how we treat those around us. The second way that we take God's name in vain is using God's name to justify our actions. You see, some use God's name as justification to get away with what they really want to do. And marriages have been ended, and business decisions are made, and life courses have been set, all using God's name. And it's kind of a trump card of sorts, that God told me to do this, therefore don't you judge me for what I'm doing. Oftentimes I hear this phrase that God just wants me to be happy, and it's used to justify sin or to get what that person is after. And let me be clear, if God is telling you to do something that doesn't align with what the Bible says, that's not God telling you to do that thing. That's you using God's name to justify what you really want to do. And that's an example of what it means to take God's name in vain. The last way that we take God's name in vain is using his name as a curse word. Not taking God's name in vain is much more than just avoiding using God's name as a curse word. In fact, I don't even think that's the primary message of this commandment. You see, God is much more interested in what we do in his name than what we do with his name. However, that doesn't mean that we should just start using God's name as a curse word. I think this is still an important piece of what it means to not take God's name in vain. We should still approach God with honor and respect because he is a holy God. And I don't think that the most honoring and respecting thing that we can do is to use his name as a curse word. Now, is it the worst possible sin that we can commit to say, "Oh my God"? No, probably not, but I still think that we should treat his name with reverence and respect. You see, part of not taking God's name in vain is not using his name as a curse word. So the point of this passage, the point of this commandment is that you are God's representative, and what you do, what you say, tells those around you something about him. And the challenge of this verse is that we are charged to represent him well. So let's not take God's name in vain by being poor representatives. Let's not throw God's name around like it's worthless or hollow, but let's represent God well through our actions and through the words that we say. Thank you for watching. I hope that you learned something, and if you did, would you subscribe to this channel and then also leave a comment? I would love to hear from you. Not taking God's name in vain is taking God's